We're seeing a new gilded age where inheritance is the deciding factor in who becomes the wealthiest. Annalee Newitz. Bending Not Breaking. Season 4, Episode 9. Out of the Past. And welcome back to another episode of Bending Not Breaking. I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
And this is Ben.
And we are so excited. Max, as always, is on the dials making us sound all great.
Isn't he great?
He's just wonderful.
I'm a big fan.
Oh, of Max?
Yeah.
Aren't we all?
I mean, maybe not all of us.
I don't know a person who doesn't like Max.
Fair. Okay.
I've yet to hear a listener be like, oh,
that Max
that
guy.
Max who speaks 3 times an episode really grinds my gears. But we love having him here.
This is true.
But we are jumping on to more Legend of Korra, Book 1, Episode 9, Out of the Past.
That's right.
And this is, again, one of those episodes, a lot to tackle.
There's so much.
And so we're bringing in some help.
We need the help.
So I need you. Who do we have here with us today to discuss all things Legend of Korra?
All right, y'all. So here's the deal. I'm going to tell you a little story. So I
love stories.
As y'all know, if you listen to the Avatar, season 3, I started going to div school, and I was like, oh my goodness, I got into div school. And then I was like, I don't know how I feel about it. And
Short for divinity, correct?
Yeah, divinity school.
Yeah.
And on my first day, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. And then, of course, this person was in my class, and I was like, OMG, this just got so much better. So I'm so excited to welcome Alicia T. Crosby. And her pronouns are her and hers, and we're so excited she's here. And she is a justice educator and activist, sometimes reluctant minister, and she is so profound when it comes to what she is able to say and the voice that she is using. She addresses spiritual, systemic, and interpersonal harm that people experience on the daily. If you follow her on Twitter, we'll hear her handles later. But one of the things I really appreciate about her is that she's a really great co-host of her own podcast with Andre Henry, who, if you listen to our last season, you heard him in our finale. So she is the co-host of Hope and Hard Pills with him, and her coolest title, in my humble opinion, is that she is a professional question asker and my friend. Alicia, welcome to Bending Not Breaking.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
I'm excited for you to be here. This is going to be legit. I'm really excited. So you chose inheritance as the lens for our episode today. Can you just give us a brief picture on what inheritance means to you?
Oh gosh, yeah. So one of the things I want to start by saying is, like, when I looked at this episode, I saw so many tethers, right? Like, there were so many tethers to the people in the episode, so many tethers to people who were elders, and some of these elders that actually transitioned into becoming ancestors. And so, like, I just saw this theme of lineage. Like, what does it mean when something gets passed down? Like, what does it mean when you're, at the end of the line, now you're holding this thing? And so that's where inheritance came from for me. I think that there are so many of us who have inheritances that we know of, and that we acknowledge, and some inheritances that are a little bit more difficult for us to claim. Sometimes our histories are obscured. Sometimes, the present situations that we find ourselves in are a lot more complex than we recognize. But we stand to hold something. We stand to gain something, good, bad, and different. And that's what came up for me in this episode when I was looking at it. And so that's kind of my quick and dirty on inheritance.
I love it. The quick and dirty on inheritance. There's so much there's so much there. I really love it.
Speaking of the quick and dirty, before we jump into anything else, we should probably recap this episode. And Ben, it is your turn.
I'm pretty sure it's your turn,
to recap
Sunshine.
this episode in our 30-second
all
recap.
Of the odd recaps.
And so, Ben,
you
have 30 seconds on the clock.
You recap.
On your mark,
I don't understand why you ignore me. Okay, so here's the deal. What happens is, Korra got captured, and they're like, oh my god, Korra got captured. And Karlach's like, I did it, but I'm not going to tell anybody that I did it. So he confuses everybody and says, no, Amon did it. And so then they go and find Amon, and like Lin Beifong is like super neat, and she pulls on her meta building, even
15
though she's
seconds.
hurt, and she's like, okay, we got to go faster. Anyway, they go and rescue all the police people. Then they're like, oh my god, Korra's not here. And then they're like, where's Korra? And then Korra escapes because she's totally BA, and she gets out of there, even though that she was like, don't underestimate her, and then they underestimate her and she gets away.
Stop.
I didn't cover everything.
All the flashbacks.
Oh, I forgot all those.
So many flashbacks.
There's a lot that happens.
Like half the episode is a flashback.
I covered the present stuff.
That's very true, and I'm proud of you for that. Well done.
Alicia, I don't know if you know this, but recapping 20 minutes of time in 30 seconds is pretty hard.
It's incredibly difficult, and that episode was particularly full, so I understand it.
See, she gets me.
A lot of things happening in this show.
I love it.
And so I think, can we break down what inheritance really is? Because I feel like people understand this like, oh, it's the money you get when someone dies.
Like, there's a very clinical understanding of inheritance, right? It's in terms of like literally what you inherit when someone dies.
Right.
Like
like
things
that's the
and money that are given to you when someone dies.
And so you almost have to assume that I only inherit things when someone is dead and passes that on to me. And I feel like there's a lot more. And so what is inheritance? What does that truly mean, and what all falls under that umbrella?
Well, kind of, Alicia, as you said, I really think that we inherit things just even from experiences in our own lives, like, right? And so I feel like even when something happens to us, when that happens, we inherit something from that experience, and it guides us, and it helps us, or it can hinder us, right? We can inherit not great things. And I think you said that, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. Can you expand on that? And what am I missing? What am I not speaking to?
I mean, I think that one of the things that we sometimes forget about inheritance is that it's connected very closely to legacy. And when we look at, Legend of Korra, when we look at, the Avatar story more broadly, we're looking at legacy. We're looking at lineage. And we can't get away from that. Like, we can't get away from like all of these tethers, like all these ways that people are knit together, and like their gifts, their trials, their circumstances get passed down from person to person.
Well, and that's kind of the premise of like the Avatar cycle in a way, right? This person is reincarnated with the spirit of Rava. Spoiler alert. And what happens is...
Just drop in season 2 spoilers in the middle of a season 1 podcast.
People know that this is a spoiler podcast. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, like, that's the whole premise, right? And so the fact that this whole episode, Korra is connecting with Aang and listening from this direct past life, right? So tell me about your experience with that. What are your thoughts there, Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, because I'm trying to just remember like the story, but like at this point, like Korra is not yet the Avatar, and so it's significant for her to hear from Aang and for her to be able to connect in that way. Like, she's still got that thing missing, like where she's not quite there. And so, there's a part of the story she's yet to unpack. And I think that this storyline in this episode is like really, really like crucial, because you get to see like, Aang's missteps. You get to see the missteps of like really a number of people in here, as well as, the ways that someone benefited from it, from like that learning, from the learning of a legacy. So, we can't talk about like, inheritance without talking about Tarlok, right? So the episode before this, like we find out that he's a bloodbender, and that's a gift. I guess we can call it that. That's inherited from his father, Yakon. And, you see in this episode, I think it's this episode where there's, the situation that takes place with Aang and with Toph and like so many of like our other favorites from Avatar in their adulthood as, the city is forming and they're figuring out governance and what have you. But, Yakon is this bloodbender who passes this gift, quote unquote, on down to his son. In the same way, like this memory, this embodiment of like this time is something that Aang, as, a guide at this point. Like he's not, connected through that avatar link just yet. But like, as someone who's connected like in this community to Korra, passes down this memory, and it helps her, finally do her whole breakout thing.
Yeah, there's a lot there. One of the things that I wrote down with Tarlok is the way that he engages with the world now, right? It's more than he inherited this gift of bloodbending to me. To like what I really like honed in on, I think, was his way of treating and manipulating people was an inheritance as well. Like because like we grow up not having anything in our toolbox, but because of the way he was raised by Yakone, one of the tools in his toolbox was using power over. We talked about that way back in episode 3 of this season. And what I'm realizing is that hurt people, and because Tarlok was hurt, that's the tool that he has in his toolbox, is to wield pain and hurt elsewhere. And I think that's a really tough thing to inherit, right?
Absolutely. And like he, out of that pain wanted to build on his father's legacy in a way that, is concerning. He understood that like, being a part of a criminal enterprise wasn't necessarily the move. And so like, what did he do? He went into government. He went into a place like where he could exercise his power and where he could like, secure and consolidate power, and like and to do so for his own sort of like nefarious purposes, but could kind of go unchecked because he's a governor, he's in governance, like how could he do any wrong? So he like part of the inheritance is that he's like he smarted up, he got smarter and like did things a bit more efficiently than his dad did.
That really ties in to how I feel about our world currently. Things that were done in the past have become things that are now frowned upon. And so those same people had to figure out how to do it in a way that is, quote,
a little bit under the radar,
right. Or, et cetera. And it just like the parallel between going from criminal to government is somewhat uncanny. In terms of how we have inherited our current legacy in the United States.
More reason to speak on this. Like, so what's so funny is like right now, I'm watching Quantico, right? And one of the fascinating things about the season that I'm in is that one of the main characters, or a few of the main characters, are actually now tethered to the CIA. And like, what does it mean when this government agency is like specifically formed to do things like in an illegal manner? Like, I just think it's like a fascinating thing to think about. Like, there's so many parts of government that, yes, when done ideally, there can be for the people, but it is so easy for people to like get into positions of authority and use them to manipulate, and to manipulate in a more sophisticated fashion than they could do through other means. And I think that that's what we see with Tarlok, is that he, is sophisticated in a way that his father isn't, and perhaps, that other people in his family aren't. And he is, he looks the part, he speaks the part. And this is why he's able to get away with what he gets away with for so long.
It just makes me feel dirty. That's just where I am right
It's
now.
icky. It's so ick. It's so ick.
Well, it's so interesting because we've talked about how so many things how tools and resources that are available are not necessarily ones that are negative or positive, but it's the way that we use those tools. And so Tarlok has inherited bloodbending, and I'm having a really tough time thinking of what is the positive use of bloodbending. And if that's like so how do we learn if these things that we are inheriting are things that we need to drop and not lift up anymore, or things that can be used for good? And that line, I think, can be a little bit gray sometimes, but how do we identify these things that we're inheriting from maybe our parents or from our past, that we can then kind of pinpoint and say, I need to let this go and not let this be a part of my legacy moving forward?
And sometimes it's not just like needing to let it go, but it's needing to say, what went through my mind when you asked that question is what's the benefit? And it reminded me of, you all remember Brenna Lynn from episode 4. She has a video out there that has a theory around bloodbending and how it is part of the healing process, right? And one of the things I like about that is that if bloodbending could be used theoretically to be a very important and powerful medical tool, right? But we don't let anybody cut anyone open. We let there needs to be credible. They need to be there needs to be a lot of steps involved. Like anybody can wield a scalpel, but only the people who are allowed to wield a scalpel have the pedigree. Not pedigree. That's the wrong word. The the ability and the training to do so. Right. And so for me, when I think about that, it's we inherit tools, and how we use them, we only use them to the capacity we know how to. If we never explore what it would be like to do it in a medical faculty, then we're wasting it, right? But at the same time, how do you balance this idea of like this tool in the wrong hands and in a lot of hands,
in most hands,
if you will, rather, it becomes not good. So like bloodbending is this weird thing where I wonder what that would be like. So that's just a thought. Alicia, what are your thoughts on that?
It's tricky. It's really tricky because I mean, I could very easily see like bloodbending being used as a force for good. Some of that I think though is, determined by who has access like to learn about this, who has access to wield this particular power. Bloodbending is, an offshoot of waterbending, but, I don't know if airbenders, who are known for like having to be, patient and precise and like move through things with a certain type of, energy. What if they had the capacity to do bloodbending, right? Like with them being so mindful, or at least maybe partnering with those waterbenders who can bloodbend, like would that change like the scope of the field? When people are limited, where there's a select group of people who has the ability and capacity to do something, I wonder if like we limit the space of imagination for what could be done. So that's kind of where my first thought goes there. But yeah, access is definitely a thing, but also imagination, right? Like when we see inheritances, go awry, or people use them for like not so good things, they have a limited scope of imagination. They can't imagine a world in which certain things are possible or certain things are impossible. And I think that's something that we have to take into consideration, because honestly, there are people who are out here, whose legacy, where their inheritance is the suppression of thought and questioning and curiosity, because of the fear that they have and what happens when people question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you just said that I'm interested in unpacking a little bit. One of the things that
let's take a deep dive.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, like, okay, so I wonder what it would be like for a non-bender to be like, no, bending itself is a tool that has been misused, right? Which is kind of the root of this equalist movement, right? Bending is the problem. Bloodbending is just further proof that bending is the issue, right? And so it's if we expand the metaphor past bloodbending to bending itself, there's a huge so you're talking about access, like literally only the benders have access, and then narrow that field to just waterbenders, right? And so who has access? It's really kind of terrifying to think about, like the power and privilege involved in legacy, and like I guess no one else will be able to be this like powerful medical bloodbender when you only have a small crop of people that have the capacity to do so. So I think that when we inherit, like the equalist movement has been around for a while. If we read the comics, it's been growing for years and years now. And the fact that it has grown to this point, and we've inherited this moment in time, it makes me question, like, asking is being able to bend the equivalent of being able to wield a gun? Right? Is like, does a non-bender see a bender and worry that they're holding the equivalent of a gun in their hand? And it's just, I don't know. There's just a lot there about.
Mhm.
It's icky. It's icky. It's icky.
But I mean, but you
Sit in the
named it.
discomfort.
It's about power and privilege, and benders in this world to some extent have um, they've exercised power over. Non-benders don't have like the same access to things, and we actually see further restriction of those accesses throughout the course of this season. And so yeah, there's like a lot of questions that have to come up.
Oh, okay. Do you have, Sunshine, another moment of inheritance that you want to talk about?
I do. I look at metal bending as a form of inheritance in the same way. This knowledge that has been passed down from Toph to, we don't know it at this point, but oh no, we do. We know that Lynn's Toph's daughter. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that she's passed down metal bending, and then we see that being used throughout the course of this episode. And I would argue at this point we see Lynn using it as a resource to be helpful, as a resource for good, right? So maybe, right? So because who's to say what's positive or helpful? But we see her use this in a way to help release prisoners and to help find Korra, and so this idea of that knowledge itself is inheritance and how we share that knowledge with people, and then again, what is that knowledge used for?
Mm-hmm.
Because that almost goes back to Tarlock and him being taught how to bloodbend.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this weird parallel of maybe two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that you bring up Toph and Lynn right now. Because you have like the whole premise of policing, right? Like we can't talk about power and privilege without speaking about policing. What does
Correct.
it mean to
Truth.
like constrict people based on a set of rules that we've created in order to help power structures stay what they are for a status quo to exist? It's actually one of the more disappointing things to me, like with Legend of Korra, seeing that Toph became a cop. I mean, I know that y'all will, potentially cover this in more details when we see a bit more about her in the future, but it's just like this character was just so interesting and dynamic, and like, to see her become a police officer, it's just like there's so many places she could have gone. She could have became an artist, or I don't know. I mean, she did become a teacher to some extent, but like, it's just interesting to see that this is the path that she walked, and not only that she walked, but her daughter chose to walk too. But
Yeah,
it's
I
interesting
100%
seeing,
agree.
yeah, like, but it's interesting to see, Lynn's imagination shift to understand that policing wasn't the only way to protect someone, which is something that her
Yeah.
mother didn't see in her time.
Well, I also think about this, and I don't. When I think about Toph going into this, we know from the comics that she started a metal bending academy. We know that like there was a vast amount of training before it led to her becoming in joining law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And she was even a small business partner, right? And like I guess it was a large business, but it was one of those things where she did several things, and ultimately, my question is, I wonder if the inheritance of being in the gang, if you will, the
Mm-hmm.
team Avatar, I wonder if that inheritance of dealing with that issue
Mm-hmm.
created this burden of I have to continue maintaining order in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if that led to like Aang asking her to do it. I wonder if it was, you know what I mean? I wonder if this was her emerging to do this on her own, or if she felt
Mm-hmm.
guilty not doing it
These are really good
because of the rhetoric.
questions. Yeah, no,
You
these
know?
are super good questions that you're raising. And I think that like, these are things that we have to hold in mind, like definitely with Toph, and like, and the legacy that she creates and the inheritance that she gives to her daughter. But this is something we have to ask of everyone in this, in this world that Korra existed, as well as our world. It's like, what are the forces? What are the conversations? What are the things that are shaping people in making the choices that they make? Sometimes this
Yeah.
was, this is unexpected sometimes, this is, again, like some of the pressures that they inherited from a different season in their life. There are just so many contributing factors that lead to a person being where they are and making decisions that they make, but also choosing to protect the people that they do. There's so much that goes into it, but you got to ask questions to find out more of the story.
Absolutely. Well, and so, like, speaking of Toph, so in this flashback, we see Toph. I had a moment where I was like, really? And so even when someone is guilty, and we realize and learn that Yukon is guilty, I worry because we shouldn't use our power over moves, i.e. bending, on a person without it being like the last resort. And what we see is when they arrest Yukon, like they say, hey, we're catching you. This is the deal. We're arresting you. And like Toph bends metal, rips him from seated position, throws, like the table is thrown over. Like it is very violent, right? And again, we know Yukon has been like evil. Like he has done bad things. But again, even when someone is guilty, Toph chooses to wield this form of power and bending over him. And I worry about that moment. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I wonder if there could have been a different outcome if that wasn't the route that she had chosen to go. Like, even when people are guilty, even when they've done wrong, it doesn't mean that they're not deserving of care. And it doesn't mean that they're divorced from our communities. They're still a part of our collective. They've just like done something that's compromised the integrity. And so there's an opportunity for us, particularly those who believe in the ethic of nonviolence, to figure out creative ways to impart care for both those who have been impacted, as well as the one who had perpetrated harm in the moment. And so, even if they had to take him into custody or they had to like restrict his access to the greater community because of the things that he had done, who knows, right? Like, we don't know what the outcome is because of the choice that Toph had made, like, with her metal bending. But it's possible that there's a future where a different approach might have elicited a different response.
Yeah. I mean, I just wonder.
Well, and this makes me think of inheritance, of the culmination of past experiences that make us feel like that is the only option in that moment, or the culmination of past experiences that make us feel like, oh, we do have a little bit of leeway and strength to be able to approach this situation differently. And is that inheritance? Is the knowledge that we gain from the past experiences that we have inheritance? And again, how do we check those to say, when these shape my decision-making process, is that the way that it needs to shape those things?
Yeah.
Another thing, I think for me, as we continue to talk about inheritance, not only what we get, but what we give. Like, what are we giving as inheritance to other people? And how that plays into, because if Yukon was going to train, we see future moments of Yukon training Tarlok, and I think it's the next episode, so we won't go into that. But Tarlok's experience, as we kind of discussed, was because of what he inherited, and so had he inherited different things, it's probably safe to say that his actions would be different going forward.
Absolutely.
I think we get a cute little moment of this in the way that Milo answers the phone, right? Like that, like. When they get called at 6 a.m, the way that Milo answers the phone is very much a Tenzin response, and so being aware of what we're pushing forward, and so how do we gain more awareness of that? Like, how do we gain more awareness of what am I giving to someone else to inherit when I leave, or even in this moment? Like, what are those things?
I mean, I think one of the ways is to just be intentional about the energy that you're putting out into the world. And I think that, that comes in different forms. We have all this conversation, like, I think in our current discourse about things like mindfulness, right? Like, what does it mean to still yourself, to slow down, to be in your body, to just be? I think it's such an important tool, because like when you're in a place of like being, right? Like, not when you're doing, but just when you're existing, you could, consider certain things that when you're on the go that you can't necessarily do. And I think that that's an important part of figuring out the type of energy that's like comes naturally to us and like the type of energy that we have to like work for a little bit more. And so like I'll use myself as an example. Like I know that my first energy sometimes can be very big energy. And so, in my work, so in addition to doing like podcasting and whatever, like I do facilitation work and whatever. And like, so I'm helping to facilitate dialogues. That means that like that big energy can't always show up. Sometimes it's appropriate, but more often than not, it's not. But like I had to come to a place where I recognize this is the type of energy that I naturally give off. And this is like another type of energy that I need to like exert in the world. One where other people can like see themselves and hear themselves, like this sort of mirror energy, like where you allow for you help cultivate space where conversation can take place and people can like bounce that off of you in order to like see and hear themselves more clearly. But that meant that I had to like interrogate, investigate, and then, articulate my energy in different ways. But it's very intentional and it can only come when we slow down and we just work to be in a space of being. And it requires honesty, like extreme honesty.
Which is such a vulnerable, like extreme honesty is so vulnerable. It's something that it requires us to be open and open to the elements, if you will, but where like we might get bent against. Does that make sense?
Yep. Well, yeah, and it opens us to our trauma and like in our past and like why, we've had to exert certain types of energy like in another life and maybe why it's not appropriate to bring it into the life that we're currently living into, or maybe where we need to like, take some things from the past and utilize them in this moment. This is where like, when we were talking earlier about like, what you keep, what you give away, I think that it's maybe more appropriate to like pack things in like boxes than to completely like cast them off, because sometimes you might need to like tap into some tools from the past that were given to you, and maybe tools that might have been painful to wield at a different time, but like your hands are different, right? Like they've been weathered and have gotten, the experience of holding different types of tools. So maybe it's not as painful to pick up certain things in the present as it might have been in the past.
Yeah. What this is really reminding me of is this, we briefly talked about this at the very beginning, but just the whole idea of the embodied inheritance of the avatar and the avatar, the nature of what it is. It makes, like, honestly, I feel like the human experience is, the avatar experience is a metaphor for the human experience. And it's clearly stretched. Like I can't literally talk to my past life, but I can revisit my old memories. And if me 10 years ago is an entirely different me, which I believe that it is, like then me being able to go back to say, what would I have thought then? What would I have said then? What did I experience then? Because sometimes we forget who we were and what we have become, and that those two people are different. There's a beautiful quote by Heidi Priebe where we have to endure the grief of 1,000 deaths and funerals of our friends and family, because we are constantly changing and becoming, I'm paraphrasing, but we're constantly changing and dying and becoming something new. And that's like, if that's not a metaphor for the avatar state, then I don't know what it is, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it very much is. Like, I want to sit with these words. I want to sit with these words even more.
Yeah, something I want to lift up is this. Again, it just kind of goes back to the scope of inheritance and what that really means. I think we see several times throughout this show, this episode, that Lynn inheriting the knowledge of metal bending allows them to break into the Equalist hideout and see that, right? So she gets that ability. We see Tarlok's inheritance of the knowledge of bloodbending. He uses it and wields it for power in the way that he does. And I think he kind of cuts down on this idea that I think everything is inheritance, right? Like all this information, all this support, all of this is stuff that we've inherited. And so it almost breaks down this idea that doing anything as like a self starter or by yourself is just not really a thing.
Yeah.
You
There's
just
the
you're
bootstrapped
not
myth.
And granted, I guarantee you this is headcanon for me at this point, but like I guarantee you Tarlok could probably position himself in a media standpoint of like, I've built myself up to a governor or council member, and I did it
From the ground up.
from the ground up and on my own.
I had nothing.
And so how did we challenge that of like, no, that's not a thing. Like you could never get to a place of any form of power without the support of other people.
I love that you lifted that up.
Like that's, and one thing that it drives, I actually, as I was looking up and kind of researching the idea of inheritance before this episode, I found an article that was just like, this wealth magazine did a study of billionaires and found out that 67.7 of them were self-starters. And I looked at their headline and I looked at the picture, and the first person they identify is Mark Zuckerberg as a self-starter. And you go, what do you, like, he didn't pay for Harvard by himself. He then quit. He had funders, all of these things, and now like he's used this. It's just the idea of like, and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps. Bootstraps is when I'm just like, this is the dumbest article I've ever read.
Yeah.
And that's not how it works. And so I think that's just
all.
in this episode. That's just one of those things of like, no, like not Tarlok, not Lynn, not Korra, not Tenzin. None of these people got to be the way that they were without the supports and knowledge and experiences of other people along the way. And so it wants me to just shatter that image of like, there's no such thing as like you did it completely by yourself.
It just it's not like, you know, even when, you know, people can't remember what influences were there, it doesn't mean that they like nothing like, yeah, like there's always an influence, whether like you're conscious of it or it's a part of your subconscious or it's like ancestral memory. Like we all have support and get into the places where we are, all of us. No one is absolved from this. Like there are some things you just know in your bones, but it's because like those who've walked before you like have given you this embodied knowledge. I mean, we see it right now, right? Like in these conversations that we have about generational trauma, right? There are certain things that happen like physiologically, like within like people as, you know, a response to the world around them. But it's like, it's embodied ancestral memory. Like our bodies remember, our spirits remember, our people remembered, and they pass that on to us.
Yeah, the recent studies on epigenetics have been mind-blowing in terms of what is carried on and what we didn't realize was being carried on. So I'm just really more and more aware around what is the legacy that I want to leave behind, what is the inheritance I want to gift the people around me, what is there's so much to consider.
There really is.
Yeah.
I mean, and some of those things are material resources. I know for someone like me, a lot of them are like emotional, spiritual resources. Like, you know, I do what I can to give what I have. And like, you know, I don't have money. I'm a grad student. I'm an independent contractor. Like the money isn't flowing over here, but you know, there are ways like where you can check in on someone and just let people know that you care. And that can be a part of like your inheritance and the legacy that you leave behind, is that people feel like someone gives a damn about them in a world that can feel so cold.
Truth.
Like we all have something to give. We all do. In the same way that we have things that we've received.
Well, and one of the things we've been talking about bending mostly as a form of inheritance, but also like if we dive into Asami for a second, there's a lot there as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, like Asami, has inherited a vast fortune from her father's use and building of the future industries and the Sato Mobile, and she is. I wonder, and I'm diving into a really small moment here, but like I wonder if she's more sensitive to Mako's interest in Korra in this episode because of her recent experience and inheritance from her father, where her father tried to like attack her and failed, but like the thought of inheriting just this trauma of this massive parenting failure and also having already lost her mother
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things where, like, I wonder if she is especially sensitive and has inherited this sensitivity, because if she loses Mako, what then?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, there's just a lot of things that she's inherited as well that have to do with her whole experience.
Yeah. I mean, like, betrayal or fear of betrayal is part of that, right? I mean, she just dealt with a significant trauma. Like, the violence of, like, her dad doing what all he did. Yeah, that's a lot to take. And so it makes you skeptical of the world. Like, and it changes. I mean, like, we know that, like, trauma is just not like the violent event. It's the way that, like, we hold the world, like, after that event. And so,
Yes.
like, she's holding her world differently. She's asking questions that
Yeah.
perhaps she hadn't had to ask before because she was so sheltered by the care and, like, the control of the space that she was living in. That's all
Yeah.
ripped away very quickly. You start asking yourself some questions when things change abruptly.
And that lifts up for me like this idea of how do we give ourselves grace for the things that we've inherited, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so, I don't say that in a way of not taking responsibilities for your own actions, but this way of recognizing this just happened to me,
Mm-hmm.
and it was traumatic and it caused pain and it is now affecting the way that maybe I see the world around me, and it's
Mm-hmm.
tough to dial in on that in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like this idea of like Asami, give yourself like you can give yourself a little grace right here. Like you've had a really rough couple days leading up to this,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so just that kind of popped in. I don't know if there's a real question there, if it's more just an idea of just the understanding that we inherit things from other people, and sometimes we don't consent to the things that we're inheriting from other people, and
Mm-hmm.
so that drastically has a potential of altering our world and giving grace to ourselves for those things.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to do in giving ourselves grace is to give ourselves rest. Like, we have to press pause. And, like,
Mm.
and life is life is hectic. But still, like, there are moments of pause that you can take if you can't take, like, a full-on, like, month-long sabbatical, right? The financial and material realities that most of us live into don't allow for that. But you can find, like, a couple of minutes in your day, an hour, if, like, if you have a little bit more time, and just, like, press pause, shut it down, let yourself feel your feels. And sometimes that takes assistance, right? Like, sometimes for some of us, feeling our feels means that we pick up art tools. Some of us, it means that we listen to music. Some of us have to move our bodies. Some of us have to sit in, like, complete stillness.
Well, what
But
I love about this is it
mm-hmm.
really reminds me of our episode with episode 4. We talked about, like,
Mm-hmm.
emotional restriction, and
Mm-hmm.
what you're giving us permission to do right now is what Korra was not able to give herself permission to do. Like, she was
Mm-hmm.
so interested in bottling those feelings up and not showing them
Yep.
to anybody because she felt shame around sharing them. And
Mm-hmm.
I think what becomes challenging about sharing and opening up and resting is that
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden we become very intimate with the things that we are desperately trying to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what this rest ministry is calling us to do, and I say that somewhat intentionally, it's like resting is a radical form of ministry, not just for yourself, but for others, right?
Absolutely.
It is a chance for us to make sure that our gift to the world, our inheritance that we are leaving behind, is more
Mm-hmm.
wholesome than it would have been had we not rested.
Absolutely. Because there's a degree of impulsivity that, like, rest allows you to, like, to kind of ward off. Like, you're not just acting out of your pain. You're not just acting out of your emotions. You have the ability to be intentional because, like, you've stopped, considered, and then, like, out of that you can act. And sometimes you still screw up, and that's okay. But I think that, like, also, like, kind of powering down in whatever ways it makes sense for you, allows for you to own things. Like, when you mess up, it's like, okay, like, I messed up, and you can name, and it was because of this, and it's not an excuse. It's you being accountable for, like, how it is that, like, you could not do that thing in the future.
Mm. There's just so much. This is a huge, huge thing. I'm grateful that we've had a chance to engage with this. Okay, do you have any other moments of inheritance that you want to touch on before we move on to our devotion and some gratitude?
Yeah, like the one thing that I will bring up um before
Bring
we
it
move
on.
on is we've not talked yet about Amon
Oh.
and how, you know, inheritance and legacy impacts him. I mean, we know that touch is a part of it. we There's so much to that story that we don't yet know. Um, but I think that it's really interesting that you have this character who has the ability to come into close contact, perhaps closer contact than people are used to, and like disrupt, for benders at least, the inheritance that they've had. I think it's just a fascinating thing, because now people have to figure out, like, with everything that they've thought that that's been passed on to them stripped away, who are they now?
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah.
really I hadn't thought about that. It's so for me what it comes to, and I think it especially happens with Korra as she grapples with this all season, is
Mm-hmm.
it shifts from an entitlement
Mm-hmm.
to gratitude that I have this ability, right? That this
Mm-hmm.
has never been something that could have been taken away except in extreme circumstances by the Avatar,
Mm-hmm.
and that's happened what, twice that we know of ever by
Mm-hmm.
the Avatar. And
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, what we have is someone who is stripping people of something that they felt entitled to, that
Absolutely.
non-benders never had the privilege of understanding and never had the privilege of. And so I wonder, even if this is potentially the wrong way of going about doing it, I wonder if this is still going to bring a little bit more gratitude to the people, to the benders of the world.
Mm-hmm. I think it's something definitely worth considering. Like, where you don't know. I think yeah, that's gratitude, but also an understanding. Like, there are other things that I've got going on other than the utilization of this one particular gift. And so I think that gratitude is a thing, but also contemplation may be another thing that comes out of kind of a world in which, you know, Amans exist.
Yeah. It actually reminds me of what Sunshine had said earlier around, like, we like sometimes we inherit things that are not good, and we don't have to use them. And not only that, but
Mm-hmm.
like we don't have to guilt and bash ourselves for having inherited something that is not something that we want to claim, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because if I put that in the context of like race, for instance, I, as
Mm-hmm.
a person who is white, I have to sit here and be like, oh man, white people suck, and oh no, like, but it's one of those things where like, no, I'm like, I am white, I have to claim that, and I have to know that that privilege is a tool that I have, as well as an identity that I'm living with. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do I grapple with the fact that I have been given this tool that feels really, really dirty, but
Mm-hmm.
also is something that has the capacity to make a difference? And how do
Mm-hmm.
I open up that space and provide? How do I do my best to become an ally? And one of the things that I appreciate about you, Alicia, is you taught me the difference of claiming allyship versus being an ally.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind actually talking about that a little bit?
Absolutely. It's actually one of my favorite things to speak about.
Oh, okay.
um,
Okay.
so I am of the belief that people cannot claim to be allies. I think that it is presumptuous and that it's dangerous, because when you say that you're an ally, um, you're taking on a set of responsibilities that you're not. Often the people when people say this, oftentimes they're not really like about that life. Let's just be real. It's largely performative. It's responsive, or maybe reactive is more the thing to say. And more often than not, people who are self-proclaimed allies do things that those who they are supposedly allied with have not asked them to do. So I think that it's important for people to understand that the term ally or allying is something that is conferred. It's not something that's assumed. Like, I don't like easily call people my allies, because if I say that you're my ally or my accomplice, I am giving you power to speak to my interests. And
Yeah.
that means that you have an understanding of who I am, what my beliefs are, what my ethics are, and you have the authority to move on my behalf. And the majority of people that are out here in the world do not have that authority because they do not know me. And so when people and people speaking to be allies oftentimes get upset when you tell them that they're not actually acting in a way that's allied with you as a person experiencing marginalization in the world. And so it's just not a concept for me that has a lot of utility. I know other people use it, and I get why they do, but I think that it's very dangerous, and it doesn't allow, like, most people aren't concerned about the relationship there. And if they do speak about relationship, it's like that one Black friend, right? It's like, oh, what my one friend said. It's like, okay, your one friend could say, but I'm not your one friend. So
Yeah.
what are we gonna do now?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I love about this is just that I I used to lead quote ally trainings, and that's not what they were called, but like for
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ plus ally trainings, and it's one of those things where
Mm-hmm.
it's like I've been to ally trainings that were called that, and I was like, oh cool, I'm an ally
Mm-hmm.
now. I have a certificate that says so, and like,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not that obviously, but I love the way you're phrasing this because it becomes more individual. And what
Mm-hmm.
it also does is it allows me to constantly question. It's not something that like, oh, I'm an ally now, I don't have to do anything. It's like I've
Mm-hmm.
achieved this status. What it forces me to do is to constantly work towards it, because I have to
Mm-hmm.
gain that from each individual, not just from like, the random like Black friend that I have,
Mm-hmm.
um, which
This
I
is
just
why
love the
solidarity matters more.
yeah,
Like, when
yeah.
you're in solidarity, like I remember having a professor break down solidarity for me is this. He was saying that, life for some people affords them privileges that like keeps them out of like certain situations. But when you're in solidarity with someone, you're literally breathing the same air that they breathe.
Mm,
And, I think for people who have meaningful relationships to like confronting inequity, because that's really the reason why allyship exists, right? Like, you're not an ally for giggles, you're there because you want to do something about like the ways that people are being maligned in the world, or at least you should. But like, with the concept of solidarity means that like if the air is like dusty and like causing me to like struggle to breathe, you have put yourself in the position and are choosing to stay in the position to breathe that air, to bear witness to the fact that its quality isn't good for me. And I think that this is what people have to come to, right? And to some degree, like looping it back to Avatar and to the Korra story, it's like what these equalist folks are kind of talking about. They're like, life isn't necessarily great for us here with like benders acting the way that benders do. So how about we pay attention to this? I mean, they're doing it in an extreme way, but I think that that's like one of the things that's like very interesting to me about the quote unquote villains, in this story, is that they make some really interesting points,
they do. They
and points that are
absolutely do.
very, very valid, but they chose to go about it in a way that's so extreme that it's like it's harmful. And
Well,
so I think that, the same can be said of our current situation. But yeah, allyship, boo, thumbs down, 10 out of 10, or 0 out of 10, wouldn't recommend. Solidarity is where it's at for me, because like we're in this and like you're in this with me.
Well, I think we see we see Amon. Amon, this is not Amon's mantle to take up. He's a bender, right? It's not his. This is
Mm-hmm.
not his place to kind of say, "I'm going to lead this movement." And we
Mm-hmm.
don't see any moments of him like conversing with other equalists to say like, "How do we get more support for non-benders out here?" And like, what are the moves that we need to make? And I'm going to sit back and listen. We see him say, "I'm going to do this. I'm going to take away bending. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to do this stuff." Then the entire movement gets painted as like, "Up, oh, everyone's trying to steal their bending," and so This is a terrible movement, and we're going to use the power of the government to crush it. And the reality is, if the council would have sat there and said, hey, let's speak with non-benders and talk about how to make a better world and what we need to do,
Wonder what that would have been
there
like.
likely would have been different outcomes that showed up from that. But that's not what we get. And so this idea of Amon stepping in to fill that role and taking up that mantle when it is not his to take is one of the reasons that this is so bad and gets painted so poorly. So, so much.
This has been
And
good.
And I think this is the difference between watching Korra. I don't know if it's not a difference. It's the lens of me as a 20-year-old versus a 30-year-old watching this show, and it just feels like it hits more, not because this stuff hasn't been happening for our entire lives, but just because starting to be more cognizant of it.
Yeah.
And watching Korra
Absolutely.
now is definitely different than it was when it first aired.
And watching it in this way, a la this podcast, gives us a different chance to view the episodes in a completely different way, which is always enlightening.
So if we're gonna wrap a bow on Inheritance, which is probably impossible, if we're the content of what we've kind of talked about for this episode, this idea that Inheritance comes from so many different places, and that we give it and we receive it, and in many different forms. It's not just financial, and then that also leads us to the way that we use it is incredibly important. But also this understanding of we get to identify what we want to use, and do we let it go or do we maintain it and what we hold on to. But all of these things and the way that it plays into Inheritance play into the way that we engage with the world around us. That was me trying to put all of our episode into a headline. Is there anything that I missed as like what's a big takeaway from all of the stuff that we've talked about today?
I mean,
I
the
thought you
only
did
other
pretty
thing
well.
I think that you did great. The only other thing that I would add is just in order to take stock of like all of this, you got to slow down. And I think that like that's part of where we see the turn in Korra's story. Being in that box wasn't great, but you know, she had the ability to tap into some things because she wasn't like constantly fighting, constantly moving, constantly doing. Um, there's something to be said about the stillness, even sometimes if it's, you know, your circumstances stilling you. I know that's been my story.
I love it. Okay, so what's going to happen is we're going to take a short break, and we're going to come back and do some devotions, and we're going to have some gratitude, and we're just going to have a grand old time. So we'll see you in a few seconds. All right, everyone, welcome back. We are so glad you had a chance to listen to some transition music while we took a short break to gather our thoughts. So what we've got for you now is our devotion. It's devotion time, devotion. It's a time where we set an intention or a goal based off of one of the elements from the Avatar cycle and the lens of the episode. And so this week on Bending Not Breaking, we'll be talking through a lens of inheritance, and we will be using the element of water to kind of shape our goal or intention. So Alicia or Sunshine, do you want to share your goal and intention? Who wants to go first?
I'm going to hand it off to Sunshine to start.
That's fair. Okay. I think for me, I really enjoyed the aspect of our conversation around the am I blood bending or am I healing, right? Like this idea for water bending on how it's used. And so am I using it for healing or am I using it for blood bending? And I think I really want to look at the things that I'm giving others to inherit from me, and even the things that I've inherited in the past, but mostly are my actions moving forward ones that are supportive? Are they ones that are healing? Or are they ones that are power over moves? And are they ones that are bloodbending? And so I want to make sure that what I'm putting out into the world is more healing over the next week. Well, forever, but also with much intention over this upcoming week to make sure that I'm using my my own personal waterbending skills and actions as ones of healing and not ones that are um, hurtful or harmful
Ooh, I love
to the
that.
best of my ability.
I think that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go, and then Alicia, you can tie it all up with yours.
Okay.
So I recently came across an engineer who created a way for water to freeze on the top of a mountain, and then what happens is it becomes this essentially a glacier that becomes a water source over the course of the year because it never rains up so high. And what happens is this previously barren area in the world with no water and really tough to survive has now become a very fertile and beautiful location to live. It's now possible to exist there without the trouble of dying to go get water. And what that does is it makes me realize that there are things that we can inherit, or places or areas in our lives that we can inherit that are seemingly barren because we are realizing that there's just an element missing, like water. And what we can do is just with a little bit of innovation, with a little bit of creativity, we can make that fertile again and make that a thriving place. So I'm thinking about, like, what are the areas in my life that are barren, that I feel uncomfortable around, that don't feel like a great inheritance to me. And so what I want to do is I want to sit down and just meditate for a 10 to 15 minutes just on that. What is it? How do I, and it might take longer. That'll be my intention. Who knows? Maybe I'll sit there for an hour, but what will happen is hopefully I will come away with that thinking, this is a spot that I'm a little bit more aware of, that I can spend some time being intentional around, trying to be innovative, and maybe I'll emerge a little bit better.
That's dope.
Which brings us to you, Alicia.
Yeah. I'm grateful. Let me just name that as I start, for the fact that, like, water is the element. I come from a water proximal people. And I think about, how water has cycles, right? Like, where it becomes, it can be a body of water that becomes a mist that transforms into gas and goes into the clouds and comes down like rain. And this is a cycle that's lived over many, many lifetimes, over many generations. And so as I consider just an intention and a place of devotion over the course of this next week that I want to live into, is like every time I come into contact with water, as I quench my thirst, as I, nourish my skin and clean my body, I want to think about the way that I want to think about my inheritance, about the things that my elders and ancestors have given me, and then consider what I'll give others. Because in the same way that the water cycle, inheritance cycles too, what we have the ability to give and what we have the ability to receive, also come in cycles. And so as I come into contact with water, I will consider what it is that I have been given and what it is that I'm going to put out into the world.
That's really beautiful. I love that.
Absolutely. We ready for some gratitude?
Gratitude's my favorite attitude and practice.
Hey.
That was a song.
Because it's not just it's not just an attitude. You have to practice it.
That's very true.
That's why we
practice
do this,
in a
right?
posture.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
I got you.
Okay, so now we're picking characters from the episode that we are grateful for. Somebody we saw do something or say something or be something that gave us something to be grateful for. So who wants to go first?
I can go first here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Awesome.
Nice.
So I am grateful for Amon. And I know that's like what? But I am grateful for his character because he puts people, he throws this world into question. He gets intimate, right? Like he touches people and changes the course of their worlds. And through the touch of like one person, two people, three people, like a community is like left questioning, like, what is happening and what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to respond? And even though his presence is a challenging one in the series, I'm grateful that people are taking account in different ways and considering what it means to pick certain things up and put them down again.
Yeah,
So that's my gratitude.
It is tough to be grateful for problematic people, but you did it. You did a great job too. I'm grateful for those things as well, and so thank you for lifting those up.
Absolutely.
So I'll go next. For me, I'm grateful for Tenzin. And just Tenzin is a really funny character to me where like he's super strict, comes off as super strict, but then is also like incredibly kind and lenient and gracious. And it's a very interesting experience. But one of the things that I appreciate about Tenzin in this episode is his parenting. As Sunshine said earlier, Milo comes up and he wakes up and answers the phone. It is 6 a.m. This had better be important. And it just you can hear Tenzin saying the same thing, and I think that the values that he instills in his children, the need for space, the ability to be calm in the face of really terrifying things. Like like this whole episode, and as soon as he comes to learn that Amon can remove people's bending, he realizes that like what if like and he's responsible for the Air Nation, much less his children, and it's just like it's not just bending abilities, it's his family. And so there's just a lot there that I'm grateful for, that he has been a gracious leader and a really beautiful parent as well. So I'm grateful for that. And he let Milo stay in his room. Milo was probably like, I can't sleep, and then it's just there's a lot there. So I'm really grateful. That's me.
Love it.
Love that. For me, I'm going Korra, and I think Alicia mentioned it earlier, and it's this idea of that she took time to meditate and rest and think about what she's inheriting, and that played to be a benefit for her, and I'm grateful that she did that and set that example for the rest of us, and so that's my gratitude. I'm very thankful for Korra today.
Aren't we all grateful for Korra? Like always, let's be real here. Korra's boss. Okay, y'all, this has been an incredible episode full of really important things to consider that Alicia has brought to the table, that I'm really grateful we had this lens to engage with. So Alicia, before we kind of sign off, where can people find you if they want to find you and connect with you, and where can people connect?
So I make things very, very easy, because everything that you want to look me up on is at AliciaTCrosby.com. So Alicia, T as in Tiffany, because that's my middle name, Crosby.com. So like you look at that, you look at my social media, it's all under like first name, middle initial, last name.
Love it.
I'm simple.
Super easy, super helpful. Yeah, that's incredible. You can also find us at those places, except not Alicia T. Crosby, but you can find us at BNB_pod on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all the things. And we also have a Patreon. You can support us there. We have lots of neat perks, extra episodes. You can help us choose lenses, join live episodes with Sunshine and I.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a good time. We've gotten really good at Zoom.
We have gotten better at it. And that's it.
That's
it,
the
right?
whole thing. All the thanks in the world to Alicia. Thank you so much for taking the time today and to speak with us. Thank y'all for having me. To share your wonderful insight. You are welcome back anytime.
Truth.
For all the future seasons of Korra. Because there's so much.
Yeah.
So much. And I think that's one of the things that I'm learning to appreciate about Korra, and this idea of not only do we not need to compare Avatar and the Legend of Korra as, next to each other. Like, that's just not necessary. But there's just a lot of depth that I think I overlooked the first time when watching this series. And so I'm very grateful that we're getting to go back through it now. Y'all, it's been a wonderful episode. I'm Sunshine Mayfield.
This has been Pruitt.
And this has been Bending Not Breaking. Thank you for listening.
Bye-bye.